Gun control advocates often complain that American firearm laws are too lax, too easy, and there's too many loopholes for us gun owners to exploit. After all, this thing has a short barrel, but it's technically not a rifle. And while this is a fully stamped suppressor, this super safety in here gives us fully semi-automatic fire, which to a lot of people feels like a loophole. Now, we're going to be looking at 5 of these big loopholes in firearm technology that appear to bend some major rules and appear to bypass some very well-established laws, but I'm going to explain that these are in fact not loopholes. In actuality, everything is opposite to what you've been told. The word loophole has a lot of negative connotations. It implies that people are breaking the law or getting away with breaking the law because of a technicality. And there's a lot of definitions for it in different legal dictionaries, but one is that it is a gap or omission or technical ambiguity in a legal document that allows the intent of the law to be evaded. So the assumption is generally that the law is always good and evading the intent of the law is always bad. That's kind of baked into the language, which is why gun control advocates talk about loopholes a lot, because it implies that gun owners are just, doing something that they shouldn't, that we have somehow found a way to get around the law and are doing something immoral or unjust or in direct odds with ethical behavior or the Constitution. The loophole implies there's some place you shouldn't be going, and you have found a hole in the wall that should be keeping you out. You've sneaked through the hole, which is bad, and you are bad, and the hole is bad, and the hole needs to be filled up. For example, the gun show loophole. Gun control advocates are convinced that there is a loophole in the law that allows private citizens to sell guns to one another without background checks, and sometimes this happens at gun shows, and so they talk about this a lot.
Gun show loophole.
Loophole.
Loophole. Loophole. Gun show loophole.
Loophole.
Loophole. Loophole.
Now, this rhetoric is a little sneaky because I would say even if you are an important elected official or an elite bureaucrat or even an investigative journalist, you probably know that purchasing a firearm involves background checks and federal forms, paperwork, age restrictions, and in some jurisdictions, waiting periods. This is true in gun stores and at gun shows. If an FFL is selling you a gun, they're going to incur a considerable amount of paperwork to do so. The gun show loophole, as it is described, is just a bait and switch phrase that tries to imply that FFLs are not doing the paperwork at gun shows. And the reason for communicating this misinformation is to try to get support to criminalize perfectly legal private gun transfers, as if these are some kind of loophole. But it's not a loophole. If you are a private individual, you have the freedom to sell your private property. America is built on the principle of private property. The Second Amendment, Third Amendment, and Fourth Amendment are all defending the rights that you have over your private property, and you must be able to buy and sell private property. The fact that firearms have been turned into this very specific special category with extra regulations when you buy them from a dealer, well, that's the exception. That's technically the loophole. The fact that you, as a private individual, can sell your own gun at a Denny's parking lot or a McDonald's parking lot or even a gun show parking lot is not a loophole. These loopholes in the firearm space are usually the exact opposite of what is claimed. It is the restrictions on firearm ownership that are out of line with the Constitution, and the gun control laws themselves are those exceptions or gaps in our liberties, or the technical ambiguities that allow the intent of the law to be evaded. They are the loopholes. There are bad gun laws on the books right now, and they're bad for 2 reasons. Number one, they violate the Second Amendment, which is a constitutional problem, but they're also bad because they have to be, by design, ambiguous, and as such, they're not clear or wide enough to completely stop all expression of the Second Amendment.
Gun show loophole.
Charleston loophole.
Boyfriend loophole.
The straw man provision.
Terrorist loophole.
The online loophole.
And I think this will get more obvious as we get into the 5 examples. This is a firearm tech channel, so let's get into the guns themselves. I want to talk about individual parts, individual accessories, and of course individual firearms, because some firearms get picked on very specifically by name. The AR-15 is one of these. It is one of the most restricted and regulated firearms in the United States, not to mention the rest of the world. And we think that everybody should own an AR-15. At the very least, everybody should watch our video, Why Everyone Needs an AR-15. This may not be the pinnacle of firearms technology, but it is the perfect blend of accuracy, modularity, reliability, and affordability. That means it's the best platform, and it's the most regulated because of this versatility and the popularity, not actually because of its lethality. In fact, this thing gets used in way fewer crimes than handguns, and it's way safer to use than a shotgun, but it is singled out specifically by people who would like to disarm the American populace or other nationalities of their private, personal military capabilities.
Weapons of war of a military nature
For removing weapons of war from the streets of America.
Easy access to weapons of war.
Be slaughtered by weapons of war.
In fact, they were weapons of war.
They're weapons of war.
These are weapons of war.
These are weapons of war. They don't just kill, they decimate.
The negative attention given to the AR-15, specifically by name, is kind of a loophole when it comes to private firearms ownership. However, the Second Amendment is very clear. This firearm cannot be banned outright, and so several little technical loopholes and ambiguities have been added to the Second Amendment. So, if you cannot ban this firearm, you must ban certain features. And this kind of begins in the National Firearms Act that was passed in 1934, which says that you can absolutely own this gun, and it can never be taken away from you as an American unless it has a shorter barrel. Those shorter barrels are a problem. Something like this can be taken away from you. This is the loophole, because short-barreled rifles are a problem. Now, if you've watched any of our videos on the ATF and the NFA, you know that the original idea was to ban pistols, but this idea just would not fly. There were too many people who understood that the Second Amendment was very important. But at the time, 1934, short-barreled rifles were not super common. Remember, there were still people firing cartridges loaded with black powder, so longer barrels were very, very much the norm. And this tiny little carve-out, this tiny little sliver of short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns managed to be added as a loophole in the Second Amendment. This is kind of the beginning of this thing. The NFA is a loophole in itself, because when people asked, do we even have the power to ban these things, they said, well, we'll put a loophole on the loophole. It's not a ban, it's a tax. And then the ATF emerges out of that a few decades later. The ATF itself is also kind of a loophole. Originally, they're not a law enforcement agency. They are revenue collectors because it's a tax, but now they're handing down prison sentences. And so, yeah, here's where we are today. So a lot of people are saying that short-barreled rifles, being illegal, should under no circumstances ever be owned. And maintaining an AR-15 as a pistol is a loophole. And putting a pistol brace on here is getting away with something that you absolutely shouldn't. It's letting people bypass this very important 90-year-old life-saving legal precedent. I mean, it's been around for almost a century, so you know it has to be good. Even though in the last 90 years there have been a lot of advances in technology. We have a lot of cartridges now that actually perform better out of shorter barrels. And so forcing the technology to fit an ancient law, which is in itself a loophole that bypasses actual constitutional protections, is a problem. But not according to the ATF. According to the ATF, this pistol brace right here, this is the problem.
A short-barreled rifle.
A short-barreled rifle.
They tried to close the pistol brace loophole, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is a legal accessory and it is not actually a firearm. And the NFA is not an all-encompassing principle. It is, in fact, a hurried and slipshod attempt to bypass the Second Amendment with, you know, I'm going to keep saying loophole, another nitpicky loophole. And it's too narrowly defined to ban pistols, which AR-15s with shorter barrels and no stock are. And it's too narrowly defined to ban braces, which are now in common use. And so, short-barreled AR-15 pistols, even with braces attached, remain legal, not because of a loophole, but because they fall outside of the loophole that the NFA actually is. But even states will get in on this action of little carve-outs and loopholes for accessories. California is a great place to see how these tighter restrictions manifest themselves. Not even California can ban AR-15s. You know, if you like your AR, you can keep your AR. Because your right to own a firearm is protected, they have to make individual laws regulating specific products.
A weapon of war, a weapon that was literally designed to kill a lot of human beings quickly.
Now, the AR-15 is great because it has the most features of any rifle. It is the most customizable, but in California, many individual features are banned. Some of them are kind of optional, like muzzle devices, but others are less optional, like pistol grips. This is how you actually hold and manage and control the weapon. So making sure that people cannot get the pistol grip that it was designed for, cannot use the gun as it was designed, is an issue. Now, it's kind of a safety issue as well, because you can have the exact same lethal bullet firing capability, but now you can't hold the gun securely, and it's less ergonomic, which means that it is now less safe for legal activities. And also, the gun industry now has to make these dumb new fin grips, which costs time and money. Now, here at TRX, we love seeing new market spaces for people to innovate in, but this is not actual progress, and it's eating up a lot of resources that could be used for better innovation. Adjustable stocks are also outlawed, so you'd better have normal length arms, because you can't have normal accessories. You can't make the gun fit you, which means you're going to have less accuracy when you use it, and again, less control over the weapon, which probably does not bother criminals if they're shooting indiscriminately into a crowd, but it definitely makes it harder to safely return fire accurately, which is a shame because the good guys who live in California will try to work around these unconstitutional loopholes that California has added to the gun laws. But criminals won't. No lives are going to be saved by these things, and the people who go out of their way to neuter their guns by removing the parts that they are supposed to have will be less equipped for the things that the guns were designed to do. They will be less equipped to protect themselves from folks who do not obey gun laws and homicide laws. Remember, most of these gun laws are supposed to combat the very statistically rare mass shooter, but serial murderers who plan mass shootings do not carefully use these legal loopholes to make sure that they are committing maximum levels of homicide with a fully legal gun, which means they're not going out to buy item number 3, force reset triggers. Now we need to talk about the scary machine guns. The National Firearms Act not just banned short-barreled rifles, it also banned fully automatic machine guns because they are, after all, far too dangerous for people to own. They're absolutely terrifying things. And in 1934, there weren't too many of them, so they can easily be carved out of the Second Amendment because they are scary and they're small enough that they can fit into that loophole. Nobody can own one unless, they pay $200 to the government, then it's fine. But then by the 80s, inflation had made that $200 pretty affordable compared to how it had been in the 30s, so a lot of people in the 80s were buying machine guns. And so there was a new loophole added. No buying machine guns made after 1986. That made the machine gun ban loophole just a little bit wider.
People used to have machine guns.
And most of these loopholes, because they fly in the face of the Second Amendment, because they don't hold up to wide legal scrutiny, they have to be pretty specific, and they have to have pretty complex legal terminology. They have to deliberately be somewhat ambiguous. Bills with a very specific goal in mind, like banning machine guns, sometimes backfire as different technology emerges. For example, the ATF's definition of machine guns is very specific. It is a weapon that can fire multiple bullets with a single press of the trigger. And this definition in the past has been broad enough for them to classify just all kinds of things as machine guns, even shoelaces. But it's not broad enough to just stop people from shooting guns faster.
I never saw so many beautiful looking machine guns.
Remember, the National Firearm Act creates a loophole. Inside the loophole are automatic firearms that can fire multiple bullets with a single press of the trigger and don't have a $200 tax stamp and were made prior to 1986. That doesn't actually have any effect on devices that just increase the rate of fire. And innovators over the years have come up with different ways to have higher rates of fire without making what the ATF has created in their loophole to be a machine gun. So let's talk about some of those. The best right now is the forced reset trigger. This is not a workaround of the Second Amendment. This is just a way to pursue the intent of the Second Amendment without falling into that very narrow pre-1986 ATF machine gun loophole.
I'm finding loopholes to get around the loophole, okay?
Now, the way a forced reset trigger works is pretty simple. Since you're not allowed to fire multiple bullets with a single press of the trigger just resets itself and you pull it again. This little lever right here resets the trigger, and so I can pull it much more quickly. I don't have to physically move my finger forwards to reset the trigger. It does that by itself, neatly avoiding the strange loophole of the NFA and ATF regulations to do something that I could do if I just had better dexterity: shoot faster. Now, if you have been paying attention on YouTube recently and watching the kind of content that I do, you might have seen a lot of forced reset trigger content lately, just even in the last few months. And the reason for this is that up until recently, forced reset triggers were super finicky. They were really janky tech, and they had to kind of be tuned specifically to the gun, and you had to shoot a specific type of ammo. And then you also had to apply just the right amount of pressure to the trigger. Not enough, and it wouldn't fire; too much, and it would also stop firing. But the newer models of forced reset triggers are actually pretty good. And the one that is in this gun is the Hoffman Super Safety, which is my current favorite, partly because I appreciate safety. I like it when we are super safe, but also because Tim Hoffman lives here in Tennessee and is a friend, and I think he did a fantastic job with this thing. It's open source, lots of people make it, and it gives you really good options between fully safe, completely super safe, and then semi-automatic fire, as you are used to, and then super safe, fully semi-automatic fire.
We've been able to say you can't own a machine gun.
I think doing bump stocks is fine, but it doesn't come close to solving the problem.
Like a machine gun.
I was going to talk more about this thing, but other YouTubers are doing a much better job of covering these devices. So this video isn't going to be a deep dive into some of these mechanical devices. This video is now about loopholes. The best video on the super safeties and FRTs and various other things that are out there to accomplish this mission of firing faster has been done by Brass Facts. I think he dropped it about a week ago. So you need to go watch that video. It talks about the mechanics, it talks about the practical considerations. It is fantastic. You should go watch it immediately. But first, let me tell you about loophole number 4. Now, this next loophole may not be something that you hear about in the news a lot, but it shows some of the presuppositions that people have about firearm laws. A number of people have complained that firearm owners have found this weird loophole, which is they can separate their guns into 2 parts. They can buy the expensive part not as a firearm and then buy the cheap part as a firearm and only pay taxes on this bit. A loophole that allows them to avoid taxes that the government deserves to get is obviously a problem. This presupposition that guns should have an extra 10% excise tax on them that no other metal mechanical parts get, well, that's actually the loophole. It starts with the assumption that guns are somehow so extra specially, uniquely, intrinsically, ontologically bad that there has to be some kind of penance that is paid when you buy one, and it should be as high as possible, so you should be forced to pay it for the entire firearm. That's where this idea comes from. But remember, there's a technical issue here. Guns have like 30 to 300 or 400 individual parts, and there's going to be a whole bunch of springs and pins and individual fasteners and screws. So it's only the lower right here that is serialized. It's only this bit right here that gets the tax, because this right here is the part that falls into the loophole that gives you that excise tax and that serialized requirement. And this also brings us to the topic of fire control groups. A very recent occurrence is that handguns often have a very small part that is the serialized firearm, and everything else can just be ordered on the internet and not get hit with that 10% excise tax. The P320 has a fire control group that contains all of those components. You buy everything separately. Ruger and Magpul have teamed up to build a fire control group for the 3rd generation Glock platform, which is my favorite. And it is just a simple piece of stamped metal, which theoretically you could build at home. Get this thing laser cut, bend it, and be good to go. Which brings us to another theoretical loophole. Home-built firearms, or as the media likes to call them, ghost guns. Now this one is a lot more widely talked about. You've probably heard the phrase ghost guns over and over again.
The emergence of ghost guns.
Ghost guns can be purchased on the internet.
Ghost guns are untraceable, build-it-yourself firearms that look like a gun, shoot like a gun, and kill like a gun.
And they're trying to convince the general public that ghost guns are a brand new, bizarre, never before seen loophole in our firearms tradition, because apparently guns always come fully formed direct from stores, just like food has always come only from stores. And some hobbyists have now discovered a new loophole. Raw milk. No, just kidding. Homemade guns. But once again, the opposite is in fact true. We have always allowed the private manufacture of firearms in this country. It's how we made guns before we had factories. It's how we got guns before we had the stores. The ATF, as usual, they're the ones that have introduced this new loophole. And the loophole is this. You can, of course, still make your own guns, as long as it's hard. As soon as guns get too easy to make, that's when they become illegal, which is a massive ambiguity. Up until recently, the barrier was 80% completion. You could buy a Glock lower or an AR-15 lower, any lower, that was less than 81% complete. That last 20% of the work that you had to do yourself was enough for them to consider that you were doing enough work to finish it yourself, and that it was hard enough that it was a decent barrier to stop you from doing whatever they didn't want you to do. But again, the ambiguity, purposefully adding the ambiguity, all of these loopholes, is what has allowed the ATF to evade the Second Amendment in a bunch of different ways, and evade the intent of all the other laws that we have had about private property and self-defense, etc. And you run into some other issues too, because if you have built this lower out to be a rifle, and then you happen to own this pistol brace here, you could get into a lot of trouble, which technically would be like giving somebody a speeding ticket for having a speedometer that goes above the speed limit. Or if you accidentally put the wrong upper on the wrong lower, you have accidentally committed some kind of felony. These are loopholes that are designed for you to fall into. I think you kind of get the point. And interestingly, I think that gun control advocates and I agree that loopholes are bad. It's not great when there is something counterproductive to the intent of the law, or counterproductive to the actual intrinsic freedoms of a people. A way through a wall is an issue if the wall is in the right place. But I would argue that loopholes are technically bad even if the law is bad. It's way better to tear down a bad law than put up with this little tiny janky, ambiguous chokehold. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. Number one, loopholes are very messy and they create complex and sometimes unintended consequences when they interact with other sections of the law. So pistol braces and short-barreled rifle clarified or classified receivers getting combined with other things can do stuff that nobody saw coming. The other thing is that sometimes when you go to change the laws, the loopholes get in the way. I've had politicians and lawyers tell me that we can't tear down this bad law because there's a load-bearing loophole right here. And maybe this loophole works in your favor, or maybe not. Sometimes the loophole is held up like a hostage. I've had people tell me to my face that we need to keep the ATF, and here's why. Gun dealers cannot sell guns without an FFL, and they can't get a federal firearms license without it being issued by the ATF. So if we got rid of the ATF, every gun store would immediately lose its ability to sell guns and would go out of business forever. The other problem is the loopholes are just sneaky, like, the hostage scenario. The people using the loophole might not be sneaky, but the people writing the loopholes usually are. And sometimes they use this as a relief valve for a bad law. Yes, the National Firearms Act is going to significantly infringe upon the Second Amendment and the freedoms of Americans, but there is going to be this $200 tax stamp, so it'll be fine. They'll still have access to the things as long as they're fabulously wealthy in the middle of the Great Depression somehow. This wall clearly shouldn't be here, but it's okay because a few folks are gonna make it through. But there should not be any sneakiness in the law, in the code. The law should be clear and open and understandable and simple. And the more complex it gets, the more unintended loopholes pop up. And the loopholes also will let people put up with bad laws for a little longer, sometimes for long enough that they start to take the injustice for granted, like the NFA. It's a perfect example of this. It is 90 years old, so even though banning pistol braces was so clearly unconstitutional, so ridiculously over the top that it couldn't possibly fly and was shut down by almost every circuit court and the Supreme Court, the idea that short-barreled rifles should be legalized, that's a little bit too far for some people. I mean, they've been illegal for 90 years, so it's kind of unthinkable to legalize them. That unconstitutional wall has been there for so long that it's just hard to move. And the loophole that these pistol braces theoretically are to the original loophole also make it kind of hard to move. And I mentioned before that some loopholes are in fact accidents because the code gets too complicated, or maybe they develop later when new technologies arrived. And there are suddenly unforeseen options to do new things. But even these unintended loopholes, areas that the law doesn't cover, can offer some bad incentives. So Uber and Airbnb are great examples of this outside of the firearm industry. By not being traditional taxis or hotels, they found that traditional taxi and hotel taxes and regulations did not apply to them. So as unregulated businesses, they flourished. They made it obvious that the existing regulations were a huge crimp on the transportation and hospitality sectors. But the legacy industries, instead of demanding that these loopholes be opened up so that they could have the same freedoms, or the walls torn down so they could have the same competitive capabilities, instead they lobbied that the loopholes would be closed and all of the restrictions be placed on everybody. The walls should just be built higher. Big pharma, big ag, big banks, big taxi, they benefit from these really high walls so that little pharma, little ag, little banks, the little competitors can't actually compete in the same ways. As a result, the small companies have to innovate unique solutions to bad laws, and that is time that could be spent pursuing improvements in other ways. Forced reset triggers are not the best way to do rapid fire, mechanically speaking. There's a much better technical way to have fully automatic capabilities. Tim Hoffman could have spent his time inventing something even better than the super safety, but extra work has to be done to work around, not find a new loophole, but work around these existing loopholes like the NFA. These carve-outs are an attack on the basic foundational principles of real law, which means that they also confuse the core issues, and they call into question what the normal state of rights and laws actually are, where the laws and walls should actually be placed. Let's see. There's an example here in background checks. There's two ways that you can look at background checks for firearms. One is that every American is innocent until proven guilty, which means that if a gun store is going to ask for a background check on a person, they're taking the opportunity to see if he has a criminal record before he buys a gun. And if no obvious criminal record comes back from the database, because databases are sometimes kind of slow, he gets the gun. The default is that he is innocent until proven guilty. But the other way that you can look at it is that anybody who wants to buy a gun is not only suspect, but guilty until proven innocent. Until the government database can mark him as spotless and unblemished, he cannot purchase a gun. Now, because government databases are slow and imperfect things, and they just get slower and more imperfect over time unless there's some specific pressure to stop that from happening. A bunch of states have said, no, background checks, they're the former. They are a way to check and see if somebody has a criminal record, but because Americans are innocent until proven guilty, any delay means that the guy gets the gun. And this is what is often referred to by the other side as loopholes. And I think that this also reveals another difference between me and some of the leftists. I hate loopholes because of the reasons that I just mentioned, the confusion and the distraction from the core issues. The left oftentimes specifically hates loopholes in a tribalistic way. The loophole is bad if their enemies benefit from it somehow. I think a number of the folks that want to close the gun show loophole would like to do so because red-hatted MAGA voters have too much fun at gun shows. But we need to not be so petty or even so pragmatic. We need to get back to principles. In the pursuit of regaining freedom, we need to recognize that loopholes are ambiguous and problematic choke points. Now, we should use legal options that are available to us to get stuff that we should already have, like higher fire rates. So definitely look into forced reset triggers and definitely get a better understanding of how they work. But we do not advocate building loopholes in pursuit of getting better laws. Creating loopholes and carve-outs in the pursuit of freedom is very tempting, but it is something that can easily be taken away and distract from the real core purpose that we're going after. Understand that incrementalism is sometimes necessary. You have to win back constitutional carry rights state by state and sometimes permit by permit, but it's much better to move the entire wall a little bit at a time than build in these very fragile, confusing choke points. Okay, so I've accidentally set up a very complex game of 3-card Monty for myself. When I reassemble these guns, there's a very real chance that I can either A, build something that is completely legal and fine, or win myself a prize of $250,000 in fines and up to 10 years mandatory minimums in prison. So I'm going to stop talking and focus on which of these goes with which.